Why aren't we interested in how much the CIA knew about drug trafficking? Who was profiting from this drug trafficking? Who else knew about it? And why did it take some guy at a California newspaper by accident stumbling over this stuff 10 years later to ever get it to be public? What in the hell is going on here? I've been a reporter, like I said, almost 20 years. To me, this is a natural story. CIA is involved in drug trafficking. Let's know about it. Let's find out about it. Let's do something about it. Nobody wants to touch this thing.
That's Gary Webb, and this is Alternative Radio. This edition of AR features Gary Webb on Dark Alliance, the CIA crack cocaine connection. The CIA was involved in drug trafficking in the mid-1980s. How did that happen? One questionable decision at a time. Accomplices eventually included the House Intelligence Committee, the Justice Department, and then Vice President George Bush, all who either passed the buck or ignored reports of illegal activity. An agreement reached in 1982 with the Attorney General's office exempted reporting CIA drug trafficking. Media coverage of the CIA Contra drug connection exemplifies a brand of lapdog journalism that simply prints government statements without verification. Gary Webb, a veteran journalist with 20 years' experience, broke the CIA crack cocaine story in the San Jose Mercury News. Webb and his editors were subjected to harsh criticism and denials from those who didn't want the information made public and the mainstream media that didn't cover it. Mercury News editors then backed off from the story and effectively silenced Webb through demotions. To this day, nobody has ever claimed there was a factual error in his reporting. The results of 3 years of research on this issue are found in his book, Dark Alliance. Gary Webb spoke before a large audience in Eugene, Oregon.
I do not believe, and I've never believed, that the crack cocaine explosion was a conscious CIA conspiracy, or anybody's conspiracy to decimate black America. I've never believed that South Central Los Angeles was targeted by the U.S. government to become the crack capital of the world. But that isn't to say that the CIA's hands or the U.S. government's hands are clean in this matter. Actually, far from it. You know, after spending 3 years of my life looking into this, I am more convinced than ever that the U.S. government's responsibility for the drug problems in South Central Los Angeles and other inner cities is greater than I ever wrote in the newspaper. But I think it's important to differentiate between malign intent and gross negligence. And that's an important distinction, because it's what makes premeditated murder different from manslaughter. That said, it doesn't change the fact that you've got a body on the floor. And that's what I want to talk about tonight is the body. And what I've attempted to demonstrate was how the collapse of a brutal pro-American dictatorship in Latin America, combined with a decision by corrupt CIA agents to raise money for a resistance movement by any means necessary, led to the formation of the nation's first major crack market in South Central Los Angeles, which led to the arming and the empowerment of LA's street gangs, which led to the spread of crack to black neighborhoods across the country, and the passage of racially discriminatory sentencing laws that are locking up thousands of young black men today behind bars for most of their adult lives. But it's not so much of a conspiracy as it is a chain reaction. So let me explain the links in this chain a little better. The first link is this fellow Anastasio Somoza, who was an American-educated tyrant, one of our buddies, naturally. And his family ruled Nicaragua for 40 years, thanks to the Nicaragua National Guard, which we supplied, we armed, and funded, because we thought they were, anti-communists. Well, in 1979, the people of Nicaragua got tired of living under this dictatorship, and they rose up and they overthrew it. And a lot of Somoza's friends and relatives and business partners came to the United States because we had been their allies for all these years, including two men whose families had been very close to the dictatorship. And these two guys are sort of the two of the three main characters, a fellow named Danilo Blandón and a fellow named Norwin Meneses. They came to the United States in '79 along with a flood of other Nicaraguan immigrants, most of them middle-class people, most of them, former bankers, former insurance salesmen. It was sort of a capitalist exodus from Nicaragua. And they got involved when they got here, and they decided they were going to take their country back. They didn't like the fact they'd been kicked out of their country, so they formed these resistance organizations here in the United States and began plotting on how they were going to kick the Sandinistas out. And at this point in time, Jimmy Carter was president, and Carter wasn't all that interested in helping these folks out. The CIA was, however. And that's where we start getting into this murky world of, who really runs the United States. Is it the president? Is it the bureaucracy? Is it the intelligence community? And at different points in time, you get different answers. But the idea that, like today, we have this controversy with Clinton, the idea that Clinton runs the United States is nuts. The idea that Jimmy Carter ran the country is nuts. In 1979, 1980, the CIA secretly began visiting these groups that were setting up here in the United States and supplying them a little bit of money and telling them to hold on, wait for a little while, don't give up. And Ronald Reagan came to town. And Ronald Reagan had a very different outlook on Central America than Carter did. Reagan saw what happened in Nicaragua not as a populist uprising, as most of the rest of the world did. He saw them as this band of communists down there. There was going to be another Fidel Castro, and he was going to have another another Cuba in his backyard, which fit in very well with the CIA's thinking. So the CIA and the Reagan administration got together and said, we're going to help these guys out. And they authorized $19 million to fund a covert war to destabilize the new government of Nicaragua and help get their old buddies back in power. So soon after the CIA took over this operation, these two drug traffickers who had come from Nicaragua and settled in California were called down to Honduras. And they met with a CIA agent named Enrique Bermudez, who was one of Somoza's military officials. And the man who the CIA had picked to run this new organization they were forming. And both traffickers have said, one of them said is under oath, and has never been contradicted, that when they met with the CIA agent, he told them, we need money for this operation. Your guy's job is to go to California and raise money. And not to worry about how you did it. And what he said, and I think these words have been used to justify just about every crime against humanity that we've known, the ends justify the means. Now this is a very important link in this chain reaction because the means they selected was cocaine trafficking, which is sort of what you'd expect when you ask cocaine traffickers to go out and raise money for you. You shouldn't be awfully surprised when they go out and sell drugs. Especially when you pick people who are like pioneers of the cocaine trafficking business, which Norman Meneses certainly was. There was a CIA cable from, I believe, 1984 that called him the kingpin of narcotics trafficking in Central America. He was sort of like the Al Capone of Nicaragua. So after getting these fundraising instructions from this CIA agent, these two men came back to California and they began selling cocaine. This time not exclusively for themselves, this time in furtherance of U.S. foreign policy. And they began selling it in Los Angeles and they began selling it in San Francisco. When Danilo Blandón went down to South Central to start selling this dope, he had an MBA in marketing. So he knew what he was doing. His job in the Somoza government was setting up wholesale markets for agricultural products. He'd received an MBA thanks to us, actually. We helped send him to the University of Bogota to get his MBA so he could go back to Nicaragua and actually come to the United States and sell dope to the gangs. So this was a very sophisticated operation. I mean, there were other people. One of the money launderers for this group was a macroeconomist. His uncle, Orlando Murillo, he was on the Central Bank of Nicaragua. The weapons advisor they had was a guy who had been a cop for 15 years. They had another weapons advisor who'd been a Navy SEAL. You don't get these kind of people by putting ads in the paper. You know, this is not a drug ring that just sort of falls together by chance. This is like an all-star game, and which is why I suspect more and more that this thing was set up by, a higher authority than a couple of drug dealers. Now, sometime in 1982, Danilo Blandón, who had been given the L.A. market, started selling his cocaine to a young drug dealer named Ricky Ross, who would later become known as Freeway Rick. In 1994, the LA Times would describe him as the master marketer most responsible for flooding the streets of Los Angeles with cut-rate cocaine. In 1979, he was nothing. He was nothing until he met these Nicaraguans. He was a high school dropout. He was a kid that wanted to be a tennis star and was trying to get a tennis scholarship, but found out that, in order to get a college scholarship, you needed to read and write, and he couldn't. So he drifted out of school and wound up, selling stolen car parts, and then he met these Nicaraguans who had this cheap cocaine they wanted to unload, and he proved to be very good at that. Now, he lived in South Central Los Angeles, which was home to some street gangs known as the Crips and the Bloods. And back in 1981, 82, hardly anybody knew who they were. They were mainly, they were neighborhood gangs. They'd beat each other up. They'd steal leather coats. They'd steal cars. But they were really nothing back then. But what they gave this organization and what they gave Ricky Ross was a built-in distribution network through that neighborhood. I mean, the Crips and the Bloods were already selling marijuana. They were already selling PCP. So it wasn't much of a stretch for them to sell something new, which is what these Nicaraguans were bringing in, which was cocaine. And now this is where these sort of forces of history, come out of nowhere and collide. Right at the time the Contras got to South Central Los Angeles and hooked up with Freeway Rick and started selling powder cocaine, the people Rick was selling his powder to started asking him if he knew how to make it into this stuff called rock that they were hearing about. And rock was something that was on its way to the United States by then. It had started in Peru in '74 and was working its way up, and it was bound to get here sooner or later. And in 1981, it got to Los Angeles, and people started figuring out how to take this very expensive powder cocaine and cook it up on the stove and turn it into stuff you could smoke. But when Ricky went out and he started talking to his customers and they started asking him, did he know how to make this stuff? Rick was a smart guy, still is a smart guy, and he figured this is something new. This is something, this is customer demand. And if I want to progress in this business, I better meet this demand. And so he started switching from selling powder to making rock himself and selling it already made. And he called this new invention of his Ready Rock. Whereas the customers, and he told me this in an interview, he said, it was a situation where I'd go to a guy's house and he'd say, oh man, I want to get high on my way to work and I don't have time to go to the kitchen and cook this stuff up. Can't you cook it up for me and just bring it to me already made? Rick said, yeah, I can do that. And, that's what he started doing. So by the time crack got hold in South Central, which took a couple of years, Rick had positioned himself on top of the crack market in South Central. And by 1984, crack sales had supplanted marijuana and PCP sales as sources of income for the gangs and the drug dealers of South Central. And suddenly these guys had more money than they know what to do with, because what happened with crack is it democratized the drug. When you were buying it in powder form, you were having to lay out $100 for a gram or $250 for a gram. Now all you needed was $10 or $5 or $1. They were selling dollar rocks at some point. So anybody that had money and wanted to get high could get this stuff. You didn't need to be a middle-class or wealthy drug user anymore. And suddenly the market for this very expensive drug expanded geometrically. And now these dealers who were making, $100 a day on a good day, were now making $5,000 and $6,000 a day on a good day. And the gangs started setting up franchises. They started franchising rock houses in South Central, just like McDonald's. And you would go on streets, and there would be 5 or 6 rock houses owned by one guy and 5 or 6 rock houses owned by another guy. And suddenly they started making even more money. And now they had all this money, and they felt nervous. You get $100,000, $200,000 in cash in your house, and you start getting kind of hinky about it. And so now they wanted weapons to guard this money with, and to guard their rock houses, which other people were starting to knock off. And lo and behold, who had weapons? The Contras. They were selling weapons. They were buying weapons. And they started selling weapons to the gangs of Los Angeles. They started selling them AR-15s, They started selling them Uzis. They started selling them Israeli-made pistols with laser sights. Just about anything, because that was part of the process here. They were not just drug dealers. They were taking their drug money and buying weapons with it to send down to Central America with the assistance of a very number of spooky CIA folks who were getting end-user certificates and that sort of thing so they get the weapons in and out of the country. So not only did South Central suddenly have a drug problem, they had a weapons problem they never had before. And you started seeing things like drive-by shootings and gangbangers with Uzis, So by 1985, the LA crack market had become saturated. There was so much dope going into South Central. Dope that the CIA, we now know, knew of, and they knew the origins of. The FBI knew the origins of it. The DEA knew the origins of it. And nobody did anything about it. And we'll get into that in a bit. But what happened was there were so many people selling crack. I mean, the dealers were like jostling each other on the corners. And the smart ones decided they're going to take this show on the road. So they started going to other cities. They started going to Bakersfield. They started going to Fresno. They started going to San Francisco and Oakland, where they didn't have crack markets. And nobody knew what this stuff was. And they had wide open markets for themselves. And suddenly crack started showing up in city after city after city. And oftentimes it was Crips and it was Bloods from Los Angeles that were starting these markets. By 86, it was all up and down the East Coast, and by 89, it was nationwide. Today, fortunately, crack use is on a downward trend, but that's not because of any great progress we've made in the so-called war on drugs. It's the natural cycle of things. Drug epidemics generally run from 10 to 15 years. Now heroin is the latest on the upswing. Now, a lot of people disagree with this scenario. The New York Times and the LA Times and the Washington Post all came out and said, oh no, that's not so. They said this couldn't have happened that way because crack would have happened anyway, which is true somewhat. Crack was on its way here, but whether it would have happened the same way, whether it would have happened in South Central, whether it would have happened in Los Angeles at all first is a very different story. If it had come up and happened in Eugene, Oregon first, it may not have gone anywhere. No offense, but it's not exactly, folks aren't trendsetters up here when it comes to drug fads. L.A. is, however. You can play what-if games with history all you like, but it doesn't change the reality. And the reality is that this CIA-connected drug ring played a very critical role in the early 1980s of opening up South Central to a crack epidemic that was unmatched in severity and influence anywhere in the U.S. Now, the one question that I ask people who say, I don't believe this, I say, okay, tell me this. Why did crack appear in black neighborhoods first? Why did crack distribution networks leapfrog from one black neighborhood to another black neighborhood and bypass white neighborhoods and bypass Hispanic neighborhoods and Asian neighborhoods? And, our government and our mainstream media have given us very varying explanations for this phenomenon over the years. And they're nice, comforting, general explanations which absolve anyone of any responsibility for why crack is so ethnically specific. And one of the reasons we're told is that, it's poverty. As if the only poor neighborhoods in this country are black neighborhoods. And then we're told that, it's high teenage unemployment. These kids got to have jobs. As if the hills and hollows of Appalachia don't have teenage unemployment rates that are 10 times higher than that of the inner city Los Angeles. And then we're told that it's loose family structure. That, presuming that there are no white single mothers out there trying to raise kids on low-paying jobs or on welfare and food stamps. And then we're told, it's because crack's so cheap. As if it sells for a lower price in South Central than it does anywhere else. I mean, $20 is $20 no matter where you go in the country. So once you've eliminated these sort of nonsensical explanations, you're left with two theories, I think, which are far less comfortable, which is why we don't hear about them. The first theory, which is not something I personally subscribe to, but it's out there, is that there's something about people in black neighborhoods that causes them to be genetically predisposed to drug trafficking. Which is a racist argument that no one in their right mind is advancing publicly. Although I tell you, when I was reading a lot of the stories in the Washington Post and the New York Times, they were talking about, black Americans were just more susceptible to conspiracy theories than white Americans, which is why they believe this story of mine. I think that was sort of the underlying current there. I mean, on the other hand, I didn't see any stories about, all the white people that think Elvis is alive still, or, that Hitler's brain has been preserved down in Brazil to await the Fourth Reich, which is a peculiarly white conspiracy theory. I haven't seen any stories in the New York Times about that. But the other unpalatable reason, which in my mind comes closer to the truth, is that someone started bringing cheap cocaine into black neighborhoods right at the time drug users began figuring out how to turn it into crack. And this allowed black drug dealers to get a head start on every other ethnic group in terms of setting up distribution systems and trafficking systems. Now, the one thing I learned about the drug business when I was researching this is that it is in many ways the epitome of capitalism. It is the purest form of capitalism. You got no government regulation, wide open market, buyer's market, anything goes. But these things don't spring out of the ground fully formed. It's like any business. It takes time to grow them. It takes time to set up the networks. So once these distribution networks got set up and established in primarily South Central Los Angeles, primarily the black neighborhoods, they spread along ethnic and cultural lines. You had black dealers from LA going to black neighborhoods in other cities because they knew people there, they had friends there. And that's why you saw these networks pop up from one black neighborhood to another black neighborhood. Now, exactly the same thing happened on the East Coast a couple years later. When crack first appeared on the East Coast, it appeared in Caribbean neighborhoods in Miami, thanks largely to Jamaicans who were using their drug profits to fund political gangs back home. I mean, it was almost the exact opposite of what happened in LA. The politics were the opposite. It was the same phenomenon. And once the Miami market was saturated, they moved to New York, and they started bringing the crack habit from the East Coast towards the middle of the country. So it seems to me that if you're looking for the root of a drug problem in a neighborhood, nothing else really matters except the drugs and where they're coming from and how they're getting there. And all those other reasons I cited are good explanations for why crack would become popular, but it doesn't explain how the cocaine got there in the first place. And that's where the Contras came in. One of the things that these newspapers that dissed my story were saying was, we cannot believe that the CIA would know about drug trafficking and let it happen. That this, this idea that this agency, which gets $27 billion a year to tell us what's going on, and was so intimately involved with the Contras that they were writing their press releases for them, they wouldn't know about this drug trafficking going on under their noses. But the Times and the Post all uncritically reported their claims that the CIA didn't know anything was going on, and it would never permit its hirelings to do anything like that, as unseemly as drug trafficking. Now, assassinations and bombings and that sort of thing, they'll admit to right up front, but drug trafficking, no, they don't do that kind of stuff. Well, unfortunately, that wasn't true, and what has happened since my series came out is that the CIA was forced to do an internal review, the DEA and the Justice Department was forced to do an internal review, and these agencies have released these reports. You probably didn't read about them because they contradicted everything else these other newspapers have been writing for the last couple of years. But let me just read you one excerpt from, this is a 1987 DEA report. And this is about this drug ring in Los Angeles that I wrote about. In 1987, the DEA sent an undercover informant inside this drug operation, and they interviewed one of the principals of this organization, a man named Ivan Torres. And this is what he said. He told the informant, quote, "The CIA wants to know about drug trafficking, but only for their own purposes, and not necessarily to assist law enforcement agencies." Torres told DEA confidential informant 1 that CIA representatives are aware of his drug-related activities and that they don't mind. He said they have gone so far as to encourage cocaine trafficking by members of the Contras because they know it's a good source of income. Some of this money has gone into numbered accounts in Europe and Panama, as does the money that goes to Managua from cocaine trafficking. Torres told the informant about receiving counterintelligence training from the CIA and had avowed that the CIA looks the other way and in essence allows them to engage in narcotics trafficking. Now this is a DEA report that was written in 1987 when this operation was still going on. Another member of this organization, who was affiliated with the San Francisco end of it, said in 1985, and this was to the CIA, Cabezas claimed that the Contra cocaine enterprise operated with the knowledge of and under the supervision of the CIA. Cabezas claimed that this drug enterprise was run with the knowledge of a CIA agent named Ivan Gomez. Now, this is one of the stories I tried to do with the Mercury News, was who this man Ivan Gomez was. This is after my original series came out and after the controversy started. And I went back down to Central America and I found this fellow Cabezas, and he told me all about Ivan Gomez. And I came back, I corroborated it with 3 former Contra officials. Mercury News wouldn't put it in the newspaper, and they said, well, we have no evidence this man even exists. Well, the CIA Inspector General report came out in October, and there was a whole chapter on Ivan Gomez. And the amazing thing was that Ivan Gomez admitted in a CIA-administered polygraph test that he had been engaged in laundering drug money the same month that this man told me he had been engaged in it. CIA knew about it, and what did they do? Nothing. They said, okay, go back to work. And they covered it up for, 15 years. So, the one thing that I've learned from this whole experience is, first of all, you can't believe the government on anything. And you especially can't believe them when it's talking about important stuff, like this stuff is. The other thing is that the media will believe the government before they believe anything. This has been the most amazing thing to me. You had a situation where you had another newspaper report this information. The major news organizations of this country went to the CIA, they went to the Justice Department and said, what about it? And they said, oh no, it's not true. Take our word for it. And they went back and put it in the newspaper. Now, I tried to imagine what would happen had these reporters come back to their editors and said, look, I know the CIA is involved in drug trafficking, and I know the FBI knows about it, and I've got a confidential source that's telling me that. Can I write a story about that? What do you think the answer would have been? Get back on the obit desk. Start cranking out those sports scores. But they go to the government, and the government denies something like that, and they'll put it in the paper without any corroboration whatsoever. And it's only since the government has admitted it, now the media is willing to consider that there might be a story here after all. The New York Times, after the CIA report came out, ran a story on its front page saying, gosh, the Contras were involved with drugs after all, and gosh, the CIA knew about it. Now, you would think, at least I would think, that something like that would warrant a congressional investigation. Why aren't we interested in how much the CIA knew about drug trafficking? Who was profiting from this drug trafficking? Who else knew about it? And why did it take, some guy at a California newspaper by accident stumbling over this stuff 10 years later to ever get it to be public? I mean, what in the hell is going on here? I mean, honestly, I've been a reporter for, like I said, almost 20 years. To me, this is a natural story. CIA is involved in drug trafficking. Let's know about it. Let's find out about it. Let's do something about it. Nobody wants to touch this thing.
That's Gary Webb on Dark Alliance, the CIA crack cocaine connection. This is Alternative Radio. You can get copies of this program by calling the following toll-free number, 1-800-444-1977. Again, that number is 1-800-444-1977. Stay tuned at the end for complete details on ordering.
And the other thing that came out, which just recently, which nobody else seems to know about because it hasn't been reported, the CIA Inspector General went before Congress and testified that, yeah, we knew about it, folks. We found some documents that indicated that we knew about it, yeah. And I was there, and this was funny to watch because these congressmen were up there, and they were ready to hear the absolution. Right? We had no evidence this was going on, and this guy sort of threw him a curveball and admitted that it had happened. And one of them said, "Well, geez, what was the CIA's responsibility when you found out about this? What were you guys supposed to do?" And the Inspector General sort of looked around nervously and cleared his throat, and he said, "Well, that's kind of an odd history there." And Norman Dix from Washington, bless his heart, didn't let it go at that. And he said, "Well, explain what you mean by that." And the Inspector General said, "Well, when we were looking around, we found this document. And according to the document, we didn't have to report this to anybody." And they said, "Well, how come?" I said, "Well, we don't know exactly, but there was an agreement that was made in 1982 between Bill Casey, a fine American, as we all know, and William French Smith, who was then the Attorney General of the United States, and they reached some agreement that said if there's drug trafficking involved by CIA agents, we don't have to tell the Justice Department about it." Honest to God. Honest to God. Actually, this is now a public record, this document. Maxine Waters got copies of it. She's put it on the congressional record. It is now on the CIA's website, if you care to journey into that area. If you do, check out the CIA website for kids. It's great. I love it. See, I'm not making it up. They actually got a web page for kids. But so what we had, in essence, and the other thing about this agreement was it wasn't just like a 30-day agreement. This thing stayed in effect from 1982 until 1995. So all these years, these agencies had a gentleman's agreement that if CIA assets or CIA agents were involved in drug trafficking, it did not need to be reported to the Justice Department. So, I think that eliminates any question that drug trafficking by the Contras was an accident or that it was a matter of just a few rotten apples. I think what this says is that it was anticipated by the Justice Department, it was anticipated by the CIA, and steps were taken to ensure that there was a loophole in the law so that when it ever became public knowledge, nobody could be prosecuted for it. The other thing is, when George Bush pardoned, remember those Christmas pardons that he handed out when he was on his way out the door a couple years ago? Everybody media focused, Caspar Weinberger got pardoned. Isn't this terrible? Well, if you look down the list of names, the other pardons he handed out was a guy named Claire George. There was a guy named Alan Fires. There was another guy named Joe Fernandez. And these stories sort of brushed them off and said, well, they were CIA officials, and we're not going to say much more about it. These were the CIA officials that were responsible for the Contra war. These were the men that were running the Contra operation. And the text of Bush's pardon not only pardons them for the crimes of Iran-Contra, it pardons them for everything. So now that we know about it, we can't even do anything about it. They've all received presidential pardons. So where does that leave us? Well, I think it sort of leads us to rely on the judgment of history. But that is a major step. We didn't know about this stuff 2 years ago. We know about it now. We've got congressmen who are no longer willing to believe that the CIA is honorable men, as William Colby called them. And we've got approximately 1,000 pages of evidence of CIA drug trafficking on the public record finally. Now, that said, let me tell you, there are thousands of pages more that we still don't know about. The CIA report that came out in October was originally 600 pages. By the time we got a hold of it, it was 300 pages. One last thing I want to mention. Bob Perry, who is a fine investigative reporter, he runs a magazine in Washington called IF Magazine, and he's got a great website, if you can check it out. He did a story about 2 weeks ago about some of the stuff that was contained in the CIA report that we didn't get to see. And one of the stories he wrote was about how there was a second CIA drug ring in south central Los Angeles that ran from 1988 to 1991. This was not even the one I wrote about. There was another one there. This was classified. The interesting thing is it was run by a CIA agent who had participated in the Contra War, And the reason it was classified is because it's under investigation by the CIA. I doubt very seriously we'll ever hear another word about that. But, the one thing that we can do, and the one thing that Maxine Waters is trying to do, is force the House Intelligence Committee to hold hearings on this. This is supposed to be the oversight committee of the CIA. They have held one hearing, and after they found out there was this deal that they didn't have to report drug trafficking, they all ran out of the room, and they haven't convened since. So, if you're interested in pursuing this, the thing I would suggest to do is call up the House Intelligence Committee in Washington and ask them when they're going to have another CIA Contra crack hearing. Believe me, it'll drive them crazy. Send them email, just ask them, make sure they think everybody's forgotten about this. I mean, if you look around the room tonight, I don't think it's been forgotten. They want us to forget about it. They want us to concentrate on sex crimes because, it's titillating. It keeps us occupied, keeps us diverted. Don't let them do it. Thanks very much for your attention. I appreciate it, and we'll do questions and answers now for as long as we want. The question was, when did George Bush first know about this? The CIA, in its latest report, said, I think it was 1985, that they prepared a detailed briefing for the Vice President on all of these allegations of Contra drug trafficking and delivered it to him personally. So it's hard for George to say he's out of the loop on this one. But I'll tell you another thing. One of the most amazing things I found in the National Archives was a report that had been written by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Tampa. I think it was 1987. They had just busted a Colombian drug trafficker named Alan Rudd, and they were using him as a cooperating witness. Rudd had agreed to go undercover and to set up other drug traffickers, and they were debriefing him. Now, let me set the stage for you. When you're being debriefed by the federal government as an informant, you're not going to go in there and tell them crazy-sounding stories because they're not going to believe you. They're going to just slap you in jail, right? What he told them was that he was involved in a meeting with Pablo Escobar, who was then the head of the Medellin cartel. They were working out arrangements to send a cocaine shipment into South Florida. And he said Escobar started ranting and raving about that damn George Bush. And now he's got that South Florida drug task force set up, which is really making things difficult for us. And the man's a traitor. And he used to deal with us, but now he wants to be president, and he's double-crossing us. And Rudd said, well, what are you talking about? And he said, we made a deal with that guy that we were going to ship weapons to the Contras. They were flying weapons down to Colombia. We were unloading the weapons. We were getting them to the Contras. And the deal was we were supposed to get our stuff in the United States without any problems. And that was the deal we made, and now he double-crossed us. So the U.S. Attorney heard this, and he wrote this panicky memo to Washington saying, this man has been very reliable so far. Everything he's told us is checked out, and now he's saying the Vice President of the United States is involved with drug traffickers. We might want to check this out. And it went all the way up, and the funny thing about government documents is whenever it passes over somebody's desk, they have to initial it. And this thing was like a ladder, went all the way up and all the way up, and it got up to the head of the criminal division of the Justice Department. And he looked at it and he said, looks like a job for Lawrence Walsh. And so he sent it over to Walsh, the Iran-Contra prosecutor, and said, here, you deal with this. And when I interviewed Walsh, he said, we didn't have the authority to deal with that. We were looking at Ollie North. So I said, did anybody investigate this? And the answer was no. And that thing's been sitting in the National Archives for 10 years and nobody ever looked at it. I think George Bush's role in this whole thing is one of the large unexplored areas of it. Well, that whole South Florida drug task force he had was full of CIA operatives, full of them. And this was supposed to be our vanguard, on the war against the cocaine cartels. And if those Colombians are to be believed, this was the vehicle that we were using to ship arms and allow cocaine into the country, was this drug task force. Nobody's looked at that. But there's lots of clues that there's a lot to be dug out there. Okay, the question is, what about the LAPD and if I saw any culpability in them? I got to tell you, the only cops that tried to do anything about this drug ring were the LA County Sheriff's Office. And they all ended up being indicted. All the cops that were on this task force that went after this Contra drug ring all wound up under indictment themselves a couple of years later. But by and large, local cops were good. on this, or I talked to local cops in San Francisco who tried to do something about it. The DEA was dreadful. The DEA was protecting these guys from the get-go because a lot of them were working for them. LAPD, I talked to a number of them, and it was the street cops who were seeing what was going on or reporting it up the chain, and then they hit the wall. And I don't think it was any conspiratorial bent. What they were told was, what are you talking about? How can people in South Central afford cocaine? Why should we be wasting our time going on drug hunts down in South Central when all these Colombians and all these Peruvians are running around with real money? They don't have any money down in South Central to buy drugs with, or especially cocaine, because at that point in time, it was an expensive drug. So the street cops were seeing it and reporting it. The brass didn't believe it until it was too late.
Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, let me sum up your question. Essentially, you're asking about the goings-on in Mena, Arkansas, because there was a drug operation that was going on in this little air base in Arkansas when Clinton was governor down there. The fellow you referred to, Terry Reed, wrote a book called Compromised, which talked about his role in this covert operation in Mena, which was initially designed to train Contra pilots. Reed was a pilot. And then it was also designed, after the Bolin Amendment went into effect, to get weapons parts to the Contras because the CIA couldn't provide them anymore. And as Reed got into this weapons parts business, he discovered that the CIA was shipping cocaine back through these weapons crates that were coming back in the United States. And when he blew the whistle on it, he was sort of sent onto this long odyssey of, criminal charges being filed against him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of what Reed wrote is accurate as far as I can tell. A lot of it was documented. There is a House Banking Committee investigation that has been going on now for about 3 years, looking specifically at Mena, Arkansas, looking specifically at a drug trafficker named Barry Seal, who was one of the biggest cocaine and marijuana importers in the southern United States during the 1980s. Seal was also, coincidentally, working for the CIA. He was also working for the Drug Enforcement Administration. And I don't know how many of you remember this, but one night Ronnie Reagan got on TV and held up a grainy picture and said, here's proof that the Sandinistas are dealing drugs. Look, here's Tomas Borge and here's Pablo Escobar, and they're all loading cocaine into a plane. This was taken in Nicaragua. This was like the eve of before a vote on the Contra aid. That photograph was set up by Barry Seal. The plane that was used was Seal's plane, and it was the same plane that was shot down over Nicaragua a couple of years later that Eugene Hassenfuss was in that broke open the whole Iran-Contra scandal. There's the report from the Banking Committee is supposed to be coming out in the next couple of months looking at the relationship between Barry Seal, the U.S. government, and Clinton's folks. There was Alex Coburn has done a number of stories on this company called Park On Meter down in Russellville, Arkansas, that's hooked up with the Clinton family and hooked up with Hillary's law firm and that sort of stuff. To me, that's a story people ought to be looking at. I never thought Whitewater was much of a story, frankly. What I thought was the story was Clinton's buddy Dan Lassiter, the bond broker down there, who was a convicted cocaine trafficker, who Clinton pardoned on his way to Washington. Lassiter was a major drug trafficker, and Terry Reed's book claims Lassiter was part and parcel of this whole thing. The question is, I guess, what can you do to keep from being hypnotized by the media message? I don't know how many of you saw, there was on PBS a great show on informants. It was called Snitch. That was very heartening to see, because I don't think 10 years ago that thing would have stood a chance in hell of getting on the air. What I'm seeing now is that a lot of people are finally waking up to the idea that this drug war has been a fraud since the get-go. And I think, my personal opinion is I think the main purpose of this whole drug war was to sort of erode civil liberties very slowly and very gradually and sort of push us down the path of police state. And we're pretty close to that. I got to hand it to them. They did a good job. We've got no Fourth Amendment left anymore. We're all peeing in cups and we're doing all sorts of things that our parents probably would have marched in the streets about. So the solution to that is to read something other than the daily newspaper and to turn off the TV news. I mean, I'm sorry, I hate to say that, but that's mind rot. You've got to find alternative sources of information. The question was, how can I say on one hand it was a chain reaction, and on the other hand say that the drug war was set up deliberately to erode our rights? I mean, you're talking about sort of macro versus micro. I do not give the CIA that much credit that they can plan these vast conspiracies down through the ages and have them work. Most of them don't. What I've seen is you have police groups, you have police lobbying groups, you have prison guard groups. They seize opportunities when they come along. The drug war has given them a lot of opportunities to say, okay, now let's lengthen prison sentences. Why? Well, because you keep people in jail longer, you need more prison guards. Let's build more prisons. Why? Well, people get jobs, prison guards get jobs. The police stay in business. We need to fund more. We need to give bigger budgets to the correctional facilities. So I'm not saying that this is all very conscious, but I don't think anybody sat around a room in 1974 and said, okay, by 1995 we're going to have X amount of Americans locked up and under parole supervision. I don't think they mind. I think they like that. But I don't think it was a conscious effort. I think it's just one bad idea after another bad idea, compounded with a stupid idea, compounded with a really stupid idea. And here we are. The question is, what happened to Manuel Noriega, since he was our man in Panama for so many years? What happened to Noriega is that, I don't think it had anything to do with the fact that he was a drug trafficker, because we knew that for years. What it had to do with was what's going to happen at the end of this year, which is when control of the Panama Canal reverts to the Panamanians. If you read the New York Times story that Seymour Hersh wrote back in June of 1986, that exposed Noriega publicly as a drug trafficker and a money launderer, there's some very telling phrases in it. All unsourced, naturally, unattributed comments to high-ranking government officials, but they talk about how they're nervous that Noriega has become unreliable, and with control of the Panama Canal reverting to the Panamanian government in, at that point, 25 years, they were very nervous of the idea of having somebody as quote-unquote unstable as Noriega running the country at that point. And I think that was a well-founded fear. I mean, you've got a major drug trafficker controlling the major, maritime thoroughway. I could see the CIA being nervous about getting cut out of the business, frankly. But that was. I think that's what the whole thing with Noriega was about. They wanted him out of there because they wanted somebody that they could control a little more closely in power in Panama when the canal gets reverted back to them.
Was there much of a profit difference between Nicaragua and Panama as far as the drugs went?
Well, what Noriega had done was sort of create the international banking center for drug money, and that was his part of it. Nicaragua was nothing ever than just a transshipment point. Central America was never anything more than a transshipment point. It's Colombia and Peru and Bolivia were the producers, and the planes needed a place to refuel, and that's all Central America ever was. The banking was all done in Panama. The question relates to the fact that the other newspapers didn't do anything about this story for a while, and then after I wrote it, they came after me. The turning point that made them decide to pursue the story was the fact that it had gotten out over the internet and people were calling them up saying, why don't you have this story in your newspaper? I don't think the subject matter frightened the major media as much as the fact that a little newspaper in Northern California was able to set the national agenda for once. And people were marching in the streets. They were holding hearings in Washington. They were demanding congressional hearings. You had John Deutsch, the CIA director, go down on that surreal trip down to South Central to convince everybody that everything was okay. And all of this was happening without the big media being involved in it at all. And the reason that happened was because we had an outlet. We had the Webb. And the people at the Mercury News did a fantastic job on this website. And so news was marching on without them. And there's a professor at the University of Wisconsin who's just done a paper on the whole Dark Alliance thing, and her thesis is that this story was shut down more because of how it got out than what it actually said. That it was an attempt by the major media to regain control of the internet and to suggest that unless they're the ones that are putting it out, it's unreliable, which I think you see a lot of stories that the mainstream press gladly promotes. You can't believe anything you read on the internet, folks. It's all kooks. It's all conspiracy theorists. And there are. I mean, I'll be the first to admit, there are a lot of them out there. But it's not all false. But the idea that we're being taught is, unless it's got our name on it, you can't believe it. So they retain control of the means of communications anyway. The Washington Times came out first, the New York Times came out second, the LA Times came out third, and they started getting nervous because, there's a phenomenon in media that we all know. It's called piling on. And they started seeing themselves getting piled on. And they sent me back down to Central America 2 more times to do more reporting, and I came back with stories that were even more outrageous than what I had put in the newspaper the first time. And they were faced with a situation of, now we're accusing Oliver North of being involved in drug trafficking. Now we're accusing the Justice Department of being part and parcel of this. Geez, if we got beat up over accusing a couple of CIA agents about being involved in this, what the hell's going to happen now? And they actually had memos saying, if we run these stories, there is going to be a firestorm of criticism. So I think they took the easy way out. The easy way out was not to go ahead with the story. It was to back off the story. But they had a problem because the story was true. And it isn't every day you're confronted with how to take a dive on a true story. So they spent several months, honestly, literally, because I was getting these drafts back and forth, trying to figure out how to say, well, we don't support the story even though we know it's true. And if you go back and you read the editor's column, you'll see that the great difficulty he had trying to find a way to take a dive on this thing. And he ended up talking about gray areas that should have been explored a little more, and subtleties that we should have not brushed over so lightly, without disclosing the fact that this series had originally been 4 parts and they cut it to 3 parts because nobody reads 4-part series anymore. So that was why. That was one reason. The other reason was, one of the things you learn very quickly when you get into journalism is that there's there's safety in numbers. Editors don't like being out there on a limb all by themselves. I mean, I remember very clearly going to press conferences, coming back, writing a story, sending it in, and my editor calling up and saying, well, gee, this isn't what AP wrote. Or the Chronicle just moved their story, and that's not what the Chronicle wrote. And I said, fine, good. And they said, no, we got to make it the same. We don't want to be different. We don't want to have our story being different than everybody else's. And so what they were seeing at the Mercury was the big 3 newspapers suddenly on one side of the fence, and they're all out there by themselves. And that just panicked the hell out of them. So, you have to understand newspaper mentality to understand it a little bit. But it's not too hard to understand cowardice either. And I think a lot of that was they were just scared as hell to go ahead with the story. They called me up at home 2 months after I turned in my last 4 stories, and said, we're going to write a column saying, we're not going ahead with this thing. And that's when I jumped in the car and drove up there, and I said, what the hell's going on? And I got all these mealy-mouthed answers, gray areas, subtleties, one thing or another. But I said, tell me one thing that's wrong in the story, and nobody could ever point to one. And to this day, nobody's ever said that there was a factual error in that story. Well, the question was, the editors are one thing, what about the readers? Who cares about the readers? Honestly. The readers don't run the newspaper. Believe me, the newspaper office was flooded with calls and with emails. And the newspaper, to their credit, printed a bunch of them, calling it the most cowardly thing they'd ever seen. But in the long run, the readers they don't run the place. And really, that's the thing. That's the thing to understand about the newspaper markets these days. You folks really don't matter. You don't have any choice. What else are you going to read? And the editors know it. You know, I used to work, when I started in this business, we had 2 newspapers in town where I worked in Cincinnati. And we were deathly afraid that if we sat on a story for 24 hours, the Cincinnati Enquirer was going to put it in the paper, and we were going to look like dopes. We were going to look like we were covering stuff up. We were going to look like we were protecting somebody. So we would put stuff in the paper without thinking about it sometimes, but we got in the paper. Now, we can sit on stuff for months. Who's going to find out about it? And even if somebody finds out about it, what are they going to do? I mean, that's the big danger that everybody has sort of missed. These one newspaper towns, you got no choice. You got no choice. And television? Television's not going to do it. I mean, they're down filming animals at the zoo.
That was Gary Webb on Dark Alliance, the CIA crack cocaine connection. He spoke in Eugene, Oregon in January 1999. Gary Webb, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, created a sensation when he broke the story in the San Jose Mercury News linking the CIA to crack cocaine trafficking in Los Angeles. The media establishment immediately lashed back. The CIA denounced him. His own paper criticized him and then demoted him from the prestigious Sacramento bureau to Cupertino. He resigned from the Mercury News shortly thereafter. Gary Webb committed suicide on December 10, 2004. He was 49. This program is produced by Alternative Radio, an independent weekly series. AR has produced a series of programs on the CIA with Alfred McCoy, Peter Dale Scott, Philip Agee, and many others. To access our complete catalog, go to our website, alternativeradio.org. Again, our website, alternativeradio.org. To place a credit card order for Gary Webb on Dark Alliance, call us toll-free at 1-800-444-1977. Or you can order online on our website, alternativeradio.org. You can also send in your check. CDs and cassettes are $15 each, plus $1 for postage. Printed transcripts are $9 even. Please specify the format you'd like. Our address, AR, P.O. Box 551, Boulder, Colorado, 80306. Matt Laubach recorded the program. Tanya Lohendorf produced the program. I'm David Barsamian. Thank you for listening.